Okay, so thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation in the first place, and thank you to everybody who is logging in and logging on. I know it's late at least where I am, so thank you very much. I'm going to be talking about a lot of what Pilar has said is pretty much the introduction that I had in mind for this presentation, for this talk. I'm going to be presenting on the culmination of years of work, or 5 or 6 years of work on a project with Pilar, who brought an idea to me to look into the role of political correctness, to look into the role of morals and the translation of children's literature. And that moved on from an analysis of a case study to what we're talking about today, which is really the proposal of a new approach, or an innovative approach to the translation of children's literature. We do focus on children's literature, but the ambition is as well to have a use for it beyond that genre. Because we're proposing a new model, the conversation or the talk will be necessarily theoretical in parts, which might not be the best thing for 6 o'clock in the evening in the UK. But we do think that sort of the theoretical discussion around this model is underpinned by an application to practice. So hopefully you leave today, or we finish today, with an idea of how this can be applied in practice. And hopefully you leave today with an idea that for translation to serve a purpose in the translation of children's literature, it really has to move the conversation beyond objectifying culture and objectifying identities, and start considering both those elements processes rather than products. Okay, so next slide, please. So the model is based on hypotheses or premises, really. We understand reading as a type of interaction, and I won't dwell too much on that just yet, but it is very similar to traditional interaction and conversation with 2 interactants or 2 people speaking. And that interaction takes place in a language, and translating that interaction, moving the frame of reference from one language to another, will necessarily change the nature of that interaction. And that has 2 knock-on effects. If we think of interaction in its traditional sense, the idea that language is there to achieve something in conversation, but we know that language does a lot more than that. We know that language goes beyond the denotational value of a word, and all sort of pragmatic elements come into it, social pragmatic elements come into it, and the way you speak and the way you interpret things says something about who you are and where you're from and all that kind of stuff. So if you change language, that necessarily means that the identities that emerge during the reading process will vary as well, or can vary significantly from their source text counterparts. And we contend, or one of the hypotheses that we try to test, is that when that happens, the potential to enjoy the book may be significantly reduced. Next slide. If I could remember what the next slide is. Yes, the cartoon. So I have the cartoon here because it encapsulates a lot of what we're going to talk about today. And this idea of reading as an interaction is there in this particular cartoon. You have a father, or it could be a father or a mother or a legal guardian in this kind of traditional setting of speaking to or enacting the narrative for the child. So already we see that in this situation, reading is a social event, a social activity. And even though the joke is, you'd never expect a child to read Ulysses or to have Ulysses read to a child at an early age, the idea that we tend to regulate what we expose our children to, and that we don't trust our children, well, not my children, but children in general, to position themselves in terms of things that may be foreign or challenging in a book. That's all there in this particular cartoon. So it was just a visual representation of that. We see the model as having 3 moving parts. The first one I've already spoken about a little bit, this reading as an interaction, this idea that reading can be conceptualized as an interaction. But any interaction requires participants. It requires what we would call stakeholders, the meaning-producing agents in the interaction. And the third moving part, the third element of the model, is how we contextualize it within a translation studies paradigm. Okay, next slide. So the idea, no, slide previous. There we go. Thank you. So the idea that reading is a social interaction, that reading can be viewed as an interaction is not a particularly new idea. It goes back even to the 19th century, and throughout the 20th century, we know as well that things like reader response and reception theory have tried to find ways of gathering empirical data on how people or readers gather or interpret certain meanings or certain books. We're not really interested in meaning, but before all of that, we wanted to take a step back and look at the literature and see what the foundation was, the real life foundation was for maybe reconceptualizing reading as an interaction. And we know from the literature that developmental stages do punctuate, for a child, do punctuate how reading becomes social. So you take it from the very baby, where you have babies that don't really understand what a book is. They think of it as an object, and they might throw it against something, or that they might pretend that it's a car on a carpet, or something like that. But then all of a sudden, in the toddler stage, your studies indicate that children begin to understand that there's a performative element to this thing that's in front of them, to this book. So they pick it up and they might babble their way through it because they may have seen a parent doing exactly that, picking it up and reading something out of it. And that stage then moves on to the scene that we saw in the cartoon, where a child is sometimes read to, not all the time, but sometimes read to in that traditional scene. And that all of a sudden becomes a social event for the child. And what's really interesting about that is the book is there as a locus of meaning and a narrative that is enacted by a narrative voice. But that narrative voice is external and they're present in the social event. Whereas as children develop symbolic comprehension and begin to read on their own, when reading becomes a solo activity, it doesn't mean that it ceases to be a social event and that the interaction is that, or that there's no interaction. That external voice, that external narrator just becomes internalized. And the other thing that we took note of in the literature is that, somebody who's an avid reader at a young age, that can become a strong predictor of literacy attainment in later life, but it's also a predictor of something that's called external reading motivation. So this idea that you read for just for the sake of reading without any motivation, like you might have in primary school, where you get a gold star for reading a book, or back that slide moved on, I think. I was nearly done. So those two things, it's interesting. We wanted to ask the question of what role can translation play in that development, in both developing, and especially in developing extrinsic reading motivation. Okay, thank you very much. So that's the reading and interaction, reading as an interaction part, and now the stakeholders. So if we want to conceptualize reading as, we move forward again, just back one. So if we want to talk about reading as an interaction versus literary interaction, we want to make sure that the model concentrates on something that's not meaning like other reader response models, but identity, right? And who is talking, who is carrying out the conversation? That's really the question that we want to answer in the next couple of slides. So the reader will always have to be in the listener position, because when you have an interaction, you have a speaker and you have a listener, and there's turn taking, there's negotiating norms, like all the kind of things that happen in normal interaction. But when you're reading, your reader has to be in the listener position always, interpreting what the speaker is saying, and the speaker is going to have to come from the novel or the book or the narrative that is being read. So if we move on to the next one, to the next slide, we can see what that might look like from a monolingual perspective. Before we start to talk about translation, who are the interactants, who are the people participating in this interaction? So the first pair, the real author and the real reader, that's going to be the messiest part of the model, because we can't define the real author and the real reader. These are real people. And by virtue of being real people, they have their own repertoires, they have their own habits and ways of reading. So they're the least definable stakeholders in this particular model. But every author and every reader leaves or has an imprint of him or herself in the book. So the implied author and the implied reader, which we borrow from literary theory, are the fictive images of the author and the reader that we can conjure or that we can imagine during the reading process. And that's a lot easier to define. Well, easier might not be the word, but we have what we need. We have the tangible book in front of us with the content that we need to be able to describe, not infinitely, but to be able to describe who the implied author is and who the implied reader or readers might be. And similarly with the implied narrator and implied narratees. The implied narrator is an interesting one because in our case study, Manolito Gafotas, there wasn't just one implied narrator, there were three. And that became crucial in the analysis stage. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in a few slides. So that's from a monolingual perspective. If we move on to the next slide, we can see that sort of cacophony of voices in the text becomes, it increases by a factor of one with the translator. And essentially that shouldn't be a problem, right? But this is where we begin to see what Emer O'Sullivan calls the zone of conflicting aims, because the translator is now tasked with translating a book, a children's book or children's narrative, and there's conflicting aims between the author and the publisher and the translator. There has to be an entertainment value to the book, but it has to also be accommodated or adapted to the expectations of the target readers, or so we think. So that becomes problematic because the implied target reader, you have to make a decision. If you're a translator, are you going to construct an implied target reader in your text that is tethered in some way to the source implied reader? Or are you going to have to create a target reader anew with reference to target discourses and target sphere of values and that kind of thing? So that's where we begin to inhabit that zone of conflicting aims in translation studies. And what we would hope to do is to be able to carry out an analysis to understand the differences between the two without prejudice, without saying a translation has to be carried out in one way or another. Yeah, you can move on to the next slide, sorry. So we have the first two moving parts. We have reconceptualizing reading as an interaction, as a conversation. We also have an idea of who is going to be interacting now: readers, implied authors, culturally guided fictional images. But what do we mean by identity? So not straightforward enough, but the key to understanding identity in this particular model is to understand it as an intersubjective phenomenon, which is exactly why we need to define reading as an interaction, because, and Pilar has heard me say this phrase before, when it comes to identity, it takes two to tango. That's what intersubjectivity is all about. And identity is never created in a vacuum. So I can't create or conjure or construct my identity on my own. It has to be a shared endeavor with somebody that I'm participating with in conversation, which leads me to the next premise, that identity is not understood here as the kind of things that we might be able to collect in a census or with data, your socioeconomic status, your race, your sex, your gender, your religion. That's not what we mean by identity. What we mean by identity is the image of yourself that's embedded in narrative during the talking or the reading, as the case may be in our model. Okay, so next slide. We had to find a mechanism to be able to describe the implied author, describe the implied reader, describe the implied narrator. And this is something that I've used in the past. Myself, I actually used it for my PhD, and it's been repurposed here and tweaked a little bit for our purposes. So these were initially designed or collected to describe interaction in conversation. So two people talking and how their identities were co-constructed and embedded in discourse. It's Buchholz and Hall from 2004, 2005. And they didn't come up with the concepts themselves, but they did put them together in this order and for this purpose. And we've taken them and we have tweaked them a little bit so that we could apply it to the co-construction of identity on a fictional ground by a reader, or by readers in the plural. So there's the emergence principle, which is that identity emerges. It's a little bit more complicated than just saying that identity emerges, but we don't understand how identity emerges is probably what underpins the emergence principle, and it can emerge variously according to different contexts. The best example of that is, harking back to philosophy and the idea of emergence in philosophy. And we have something like weak emergence, which would be a wave in the sea. And we call it a weak emergence because we know how the wave emerges. We know exactly how that has come to be. We have everything in front of us to be able to predict the next wave, as it were. Strong emergence is when we can't do that. And consciousness is the best example of strong emergence. We know that the brain is there. We know that people think and have a consciousness, but we just can't understand how that happens. So identity is an example of strong emergence, and we can't exactly pin it. It's not tangible, and we have to assume that it happens in the mind. The second one is the positionality principle, and that's really key. We talked about the implied narrators and the implied narratees, and I think you're going to see why this is key. So positionality has everything to do with how we position ourselves in conversation. It's whether I position myself as a joker or as an antagonist or as somebody giving advice, and it can change from one moment to the next. In reading, you as a reader take up your different positions in accordance to the voice that you're hearing. And with Manolito Gafotas, when we saw that there were 3 narrators in the original, but only 2 in the target, in the translation, in the published translation, we were able to say that censorship has occurred, not just in terms of language, but also in terms of identity, because the readers were denied the opportunity of positioning themselves in relation to 3 narrators. So positionality is really key to the model. The indexicality principle is also important because it's about the linguistic resources that we use to associate ourselves or the speaker or the listener to stances, to ideologies, to discourses, and that's it's basically how language points to your identity or how you index your identity. The third one is the relationality principle, which I've it's so important that I've put it in a different slide. So I'll pause it there for a second and just say that the partialness principle says that an identity can emerge in discourse, but you're never going to get a full picture of that identity. And that's also true when we're talking about implied authors and implied readers and real readers and real authors. So if we move on to the next one, the relationality principle. Yeah, here we go. So the relationality principle, it's all about how speakers and listeners relate to each other. In our model, it's about how readers relate to the voices in the text, right? And the voices in the text in translation, crucially. So there's three they're called tactics of intersubjectivity. That's less important than their function, what they're really for. So there are three ways of measuring relationality. The first one is adequation versus distinction, which is very close to just saying sameness versus difference. When we're talking to somebody in conversation and we say something to be the same as them, or whether we say something to be different to them, that has a role to play when you're translating characters. The second one is authentication and denaturalization. That's an identity that emerges in discourse, whether the way it emerges in discourse is authenticated by language, if it rings true, if it resonates, or whether it's denaturalized, if it's not true, or if it's the product of artifice, if there's something fake about it, basically. And then the last one, the authorization versus illegitimization or illegitimation, is about the institutions that allow identities to emerge or not, whether they authorize them or they illegitimize them, I guess. So the best way to illustrate how all of this works, and I said at the beginning that it was going to be theory heavy, but it's underpinned by practical uses. So that's the theory of it. They're the concepts. But when you move it on to, in practice, how it can help us describe the identities in discourse and how they emerge in translation, we move on to the next slide. I can show you how we did it from Manolito Gafotas. So how the reader went back. So the reader relating to Manolito Gafotas, the text has adequated the voices, and that means that it's made them same. But the same to what? Same to the target reader. So when we talked about that zone of conflicting aims with the target reader and the implied narrator and all of that stuff, the translator of Manolito Gafotas has made Manolito the same as a boy in the United States, for example. And that means that it has denaturalized the identity of Manolito Gafotas. It has changed it so much that it has denaturalized it. And that means that translation then becomes the very institution that has illegitimized the identity of Manolito Gafotas in that particular context, in the US American context, and frankly, in the entire English speaking context, because now Amazon is selling that version, that translation to the English speaking world, basically. Okay, so that brings an end to an end of the three moving parts: the identity principles, the stakeholders, and conceptualizing reading as an interaction. How then do we move on to the next slide? Sorry, yeah. How then do we contextualize it within translation studies, with translation as a site for cultural conflict? And you can see already in the way we've applied the principles that a decision is always in the offing when you're translating. Move on to the next slide. Okay, right. I have the boxing gloves there because it does seem like a little bit of a fight. But translation studies tends to be very kind on how to describe translations that change the text, and sometimes that's a great thing. You know, we've had translation studies evolve from very linguistic, prescriptive oriented approaches to being able to describe translation as something that has been rewritten now, being able to describe translations as something that is acceptable or adequate, domesticated or foreignized, overt or covertly translated. But that, it's been good. It's been good in being able to introduce a nuance of the cultural mediation element of translation. But it has also had a negative effect, or we contend that it has also had a negative effect of being able to positively connote something that might be best described as censorship. So if we say something like adaptation or accommodation, it doesn't sound too untoward. But, the people who published Manolito Gafotas have said, they justify the translation by saying that they've adapted it to the target culture, they've accommodated it to their target readers. But what they've really done is you could frame it in a way as them saying, that's not good enough for our children. We've had to change, we've had to adapt, we've had to accommodate, because what might be acceptable in your context for Spanish children is certainly not good enough for our children. So we're going to have to change it so that this isn't as abhorrent, I guess, in our literary system for our children. And that's kind of that really just amounts to intellectual colonization. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't adapt and that we shouldn't accommodate. And there have been great interventionist approaches to translation studies that have come from that willingness to be able to change things, notably from feminist and post-colonial approaches. But sometimes the most radical thing that you can do in translation is not change anything at all and allow an identity to be authorized in a foreign in a target culture as a foreign object, and trust our children to read something and to be able to position themselves in relation to something foreign in the text. And I think that, we can move on to the next. Yes. So moving forward, so I think moving forward, this was my slide to introduce the fact that we've got a PhD scholarship at Area What University. It's specifically about British Sign Language, but if anybody knows anybody with British Sign Language that wants to look at the translation of children's literature into British Sign Language, keep an eye out for that. And with that, I think I can bring the presentation to a conclusion. If that was the last slide, that was the last slide. So thank you very much.